All right, John. This week we have a topic that you actually put on the list a long time ago
Yeah.
to give us plenty of time to do the research, ramp up, spitball the subject and everything. And it finally is time to dive into it. I'm excited. What are we going over today?
Yeah, it's a big, big topic, and I think it's one that not just the United States is scratching their head on, but countries around the world. So I thought we would look at democracies around the world, which ones are kind of under threat, as well as what success we see, and how does a democracy fall apart. And we've done a lot of research on that, and I'm excited to present it.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
And John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
Maybe just clarifying, going through, defining a democracy versus, something more, or something free versus less free.
Sure.
Versus, because there are capitalist but democracy and then socialist but democracy. Like Sweden's a democracy.
Right.
But it's a hell of a lot more socialist, but it's still a democracy. So, as is France and everything. So if we could at least set those boundaries, because they might mean different things to different people.
Sure.
So, yeah.
In a democratic nation, you have a few democratic norms that are kind of safeguarded by the majority of the people. And those include things like freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and free and fair elections. A lot of people kind of conflate the election itself as a hallmark of democracy. If there's elections, there's democracy, and that is the wrong way to look at it, because a lot of not so democratic countries have leaders that rose to power through elections. Vladimir Putin's a good example. Nicolas Maduro is a good example.
Right.
As well as Hugo Chavez was a good example. So I want to look into what is it that deteriorates it from the inside once they take power, and what we can look for throughout the world that sets off discordant bells for those that are paying attention to democracy. So I wanted to start with just protests around the world.
Okay.
And we're seeing in two different countries that you and I decided to kind of investigate independently. You wanted to look at the protests in France, and I'm very interested in finding out what that's about. I, on the other hand, looked at the protests in Hong Kong. And what is that all about? So I'm going to lob it to you. We had an election about the same time as the Trump election, the 2016 election in France, with Emmanuel Macron, who was the centrist candidate, and he was up against Marine Le Pen, who was the center-right or fascist, opponent. What happened after that election that has caused these protests? What's going on in France right now?
Yeah, so to give good frame of reference, let's say, Macron, he was and is very much like, he's oftentimes called like White Obama. That's where his policies are. That's kind of his
kind of the pragmatist of France.
Pragmatist, but also, they see him as establishment and become more elite. That's kind of the perception, like the insider. And he's definitely got like that charm that drew a lot of people to him and everything. And then Marie Le Pen comes around, and she was like what a lot of people see in Trump. Like, she would really stoke a lot of the angry sentiment going on in
the
mostly
xenophobia is what I noticed.
Yeah, and I think there it was covered probably a little better than it was here, because there the idea was she was coming in and there were people who were just angry that they hadn't mattered or anything for ages. Like politicians didn't give a damn, and she kind of just like stoked the flame instead of talking to economic issues and things like that, which were kind of more the heart of their. She would kind of just stoke the xenophobia because when people are angry and upset, that's when the tribalism kicks in a little more, and it's easier to stoke that. And so
Did this create hyperpartisanship in France?
it certainly exacerbated it, like notably.
Yeah.
Because what happens is you had someone who come along and who really just took it from like a 3 and cranked it to a 10, and then thought,
Sounds familiar.
and then let's crank it to a 15. Right. Yeah, and so that's kind of what she did, and as a result, she did also take an approach where, contrary to previous leaders, she didn't separate herself and the party from the actual extremists. You know, there's the right, there's the far right, and then there are the extremists, like the Nazi Party or whatever, and they've been kind of clinging to the right, but the right, for the last several decades, it's been understood like they're kind of just hanging on to the belt of the right. They aren't actually in the party. Marie Le Pen did, stoke a lot of that. She exacerbated the anger people have to the government. And then, of course, what happens is Macron gets elected when people are looking at him and either hate him off the bat because of, Marine Le Pen's getting them worked up, or they maybe voted for him, but only because he was the lesser of two evils. And the attitude was like, all right, dude, we voted for you, but we're watching you. I think a lot of it with the protests, Macron gets up and says, look, we can't afford all of the programs we have as is. So because we have, and he even admitted, like, we have an influx of immigrants coming in, we got to pay for and everything. So, and also with climate change, the solution is a fuel tax. And that was the big mistake, because who gets hit hardest by a fuel tax and hardest earliest?
I would assume the working.
Yeah, working class people who have to drive that truck, or the farmer who loads up their truck and drives to the market, miles and miles, like a long distance. They're the ones who are affected.
Was the tax excessive? I mean, what was it? Just a minimal raise, or was it like a step too far, or how was that perceived?
I mean, it was perceived as a step too far. Like, let's just say here, in a lot of places, if you said like a 60-cent increase, people would be like really irked, but they wouldn't be outraged. Yeah. There, I mean, fuel is the equivalent of something like $9 a gallon. It is, I think, maybe even more than that in some areas, like closer to $15 a gallon, the equivalent. So it is already so high, but it was also the sentiment that there they also have a lot of income inequality. Corporations have had an increasing influence on politics, and so people felt like, all right, so we have all these ultra rich, like we're talking billionaires, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Before you even touch a penny, before you raise taxes on them by 1 cent, you're going to impose a tax on us. Are you kidding me? Are you absolutely out of your mind? You didn't even start with 1% raise on the rent. Yeah, it was just straight to the working class, the big FU. And so what happened was, and it was predominantly more conservative voters who came out, and they're called the Gilets jaunes, which in French translates to, in English, the yellow jackets. Because if you know those like yellow reflective vests, and so they wanted to make sure, like, hey, Macron, when we get upset, you can't just get on a helicopter with your wife and fly away and ignore us, go to Italy. Like, you're going to notice us. So every single one of them put on these, vests, and they went and they started protesting, and they made a point to go every Saturday and Sunday until he listened to them.
Hmm.
And when it really caught fire because of social media, because of some press coverage, it caught fire. And then a ton of liberal voters were like, you know what, we're pissed off about this, the text, the representation, how they're not very transparent. Macron does seem to be just rubbing elbows with the rich way more than caring about us. So then a ton of liberal voters showed up. And so on the one hand, it's good. Like, you have this almost united force of people who previously, weren't aligned and even really disliked each other. They viewed each other like we view, here Republicans and Democrats don't like each other. There, it's almost like they're coming together with this, joint cause. And, they say every single person, especially in Paris, but in surrounding areas of Paris, every single one of them has a yellow jacket in their trunk for when they're in the area and they go and protest. It's that common, that popular, and
Is there a call only to reverse this fuel tax, or is there other incentives?
I mean, there are other things. They are that's one of the problems. So a couple issues, like another thing that Macron has done that was absolutely on him and is still going, that he needs to do something about, is he immediately, and yes, they're 99%, 98, 99% of the people who show up, they're loud and they try to get noticed, but they're peaceful protesters.
Right, yeah.
And then, yes, there are the extremist groups on both, like the Antifa and the neo-Nazi group, who show up and they do really, like, throw stones at police rioters and at the riot police, rather, and damage to properties and do that kind of thing. However, Macron gave the police free license to use, and I can't remember the name, but they are using essentially this type of bullet that is not like a rubber bullet, kind of similar, but it's much bigger, closer to the size of like those beanbag guns and everything.
Yeah.
And but let's just say, like, a long time ago, about 20 years ago, this specific type was banned in Europe because of the effects. Like, if it hits someone directly, people have lost like part of their hand. One dude, and this is at this protest, not in the past. A guy in France, lost his hand, a peaceful protester. One dude lost his eye, permanently. He kind of authorized the police to go from like, hey, just be there to be kind of a border and keep people from getting a little out of hand, to almost like militant overnight, not this gradual thing. And also people were upset because he did this without even making any diplomatic attempt. He didn't come out and say, all right, let's figure this out. I can tell you're mad about this, so let's stop this tax, put a pin in it.
Do you anticipate that France will go that route in the next election? Does Macron stand a chance after this? What was it called? The Yellow Jacket Revolution?
The Gilets jaunes. I mean, let's just say it's been going on since early November, and it's almost like every weekend he just becomes less and less engaged and tunes them out more and more. So I think the chances are, especially in Europe, Italy goes through a new government every 9 months. Basically, they get the moment they're unhappy a little bit, they're like, "Screw you, you're out," and so in France, it's a similar dynamic. It's less structured than here, so it's much easier to just be like, all right, peace, you're out. And they also have a lot of laws, relating to the media, and that some of them are explicit laws, some of them are more implicit about like how fairly you cover a candidate, how objectively you do it, how much airtime you give to. You can't completely ignore someone. Like they tried at first to kind of not give Marie Le Pen any airtime and make her seem like a joke and give most airtime to Macron, and that's when her popularity soared the most. because they were like, "See, we knew it."
She's being silenced.
Yeah, exactly. We're the victim. See, and so anyway, I think again, it is a situation where people need to, and the people in kind of power or whoever it may be, people with influence need to go, okay, the people want change. Like 2016 was a change election. People want change. Let's make sure that let's try to make sure they have a change option that isn't going to be the bull in the china shop.
Right. I see some correlations between the Yellow Jacket Revolution
Right.
with what's going on in Hong Kong. And I want to take a break, and
Yeah.
when we come back, I want to discuss how those similarities kind of jump out at me. What we have to do is go back to the 1890s, I think it was.
All right.
Britain had grabbed onto Hong Kong and made it a British providence. And the agreement was that they would sign it back over and into a free nation or an independent nation in 1997, which they did. The issue is that it's kind of multifaceted partnership between them and China mainland. And the reason these protests started was actually over a murder. What happened was a couple left Hong Kong and went to Taiwan. And during their visit there, the male killed the female. And then he flew back to Hong Kong. Well, there's no extradition between Taiwan and Hong Kong. And so the legislature decided to pass a bill stating that they would begin extradition laws with Taiwan and Hong Kong. But that simultaneously means that they can extradite people from Hong Kong to mainland China. And the people of Hong Kong are totally against that. Right. And the reason why is because of how authoritarian China is. They do not have freedom of the press. Assemblies are broken up commonly. Anyone speaking out for democracy is usually imprisoned or killed. It's very, very restrictive. And whereas Hong Kong is, they have free press and they have freedom of speech and things like that. So what makes this tricky is their kind of congressional or parliament or, their Congress. They call it the LegCo, right? So it's the legislative co-op is what I think it means. And it's made up of 70 seats. And those 70 seats, 40 of which are elected by the people of Hong Kong, and then 30 are elected by the corporations of Hong Kong. So you have somebody who sits in their their LegCo that represents the finance industry, and you have somebody that represents the air travel industry, and you have somebody that represents the medical industry. And they want to keep relations with China, fluent. And it has created a great deal of agitation, and that's why they have these protests. And recently, that core of kind of corporate, representation is starting to think along the lines of Jamie Dimon, of hey. Do we deal with China or do we deal with our own people? We're kind of,
Right.
Which one do we want to negotiate with? Hong Kong is strategically, it has an amazing port.
Yeah, I was just about to say their port. Yeah.
It's massive, and it is a central hub of trade in all of Southeast Asia. I mean, it's just monumentally important.
Like that port is the best military strategic port.
Yeah. And for a country that's looking to expand their navy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're saying like that's why China wants that.
Well, that's the important part, and that's also why the vast majority of the protesters that you see in this footage are all people that are between like 18 and 24.
Right.
This is going to be the working class at the time that Hong Kong gets absorbed into mainland China, which is scheduled to start in 2047.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, China's not waiting.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're pushing their policy and their agenda now, and that is going to affect that workforce 20 years from now, 30 years from now. The people that will be the, kind of the gatekeepers of Hong Kong. So they see that and they know that their rights are going to be threatened, and their way of life right now will slowly turn into an authoritarian regime. And that's why hundreds of thousands of protesters are hitting the streets, because they don't want what mainland China does. And you have to reverse it and look at it how mainland China sees it. They do not understand or appreciate democracy. Just like Putin, they see it as
Right.
mob rule. And they're not, looking to, and this isn't just the government. The people of China, who have very limited ability to research any other opposing point of view,
Right.
they don't understand democracy. They're just like, I don't understand how people would vote. Like everything in China is done for the greater good, for the government, for the community. None of it is individual rights or freedom. I saw a documentary a number of years ago about inside China, and it was done by Frontline. And Tank Man,
Yeah, yeah.
Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, Tiananmen Square. That
The
was crazy.
guy stands in front of the tank. The tank tries to drive around him, and well, what you may not know about that video, there's a couple things. It's really pretty interesting. A British journalist was the one that filmed it.
Yeah.
He knew that the Chinese government was watching him from across the street through binoculars, so he took the film and put it into a film canister and dropped it into the top of the toilet. They came in, they busted him, they arrested him. They could not find footage of it, right? And after they released him, he snuck back into the hotel, stole that canister, and then flew back to Great Britain.
Well,
And
yeah.
that's why the world saw that. But no one in China has seen it. They actively go through the internet and remove it. So the Frontline was showing these students in Beijing this footage. They had no clue what it was, or if it was even China,
Right.
And the other thing is, the guy that did that, Tank Man, the reason they did this documentary was right after he stood in front of a guy on a bicycle, rode up, grabbed him, and they went off together, and no one knows who he is or ever saw him again.
Wow. And, I think one of the reasons they are also getting a little more and more authoritarian is they are kind of under authoritarianism is under a slightly increasing threat every day, because it is now a hell of a lot harder to prevent your people from seeing something like that, because people around the world, a protest could happen tomorrow and you could go on any, even though they kind of block social media, like it just spreads like wildfire. You could see something live. It's so much harder to have these gates, and it's almost like authoritarianism creates a dam that, controls and prevents the flow of information. But what happens when the pressure of the water gets a little too much?
Yeah.
Like that dam, and the dam, it doesn't.
And what will that authoritarian do to lock down the protests as a result of that dam starting to break?
Right, and one of the issues is, the dam doesn't just like a few little bricks fall apart, and it doesn't just slowly come in. The dam crashes the authoritarianism, like we saw when the Berlin Wall came down.
Yeah.
Everything crashed so hard, so quickly, that they didn't have a structural, economic, or political foundation to build a democracy out of, which is why, like Russia, they pretend they're a democracy, but
it's a veneer.
It's a veneer. And after World War II, the Nazi Germany, or what had been Nazi Germany after Nazis collapsed, like it had both the foundation and enough, not all, but enough cultural, societal buy-in to democracy,
Right.
To where they were like, all right, because a lot of people in Germany close to the end, they didn't want to, say, hey, this is wrong because you protest, and then the SS comes on a bicycle and takes you away, and you never seen again. So, but as soon as the war was over, people don't realize a hell of a lot of Germans were like, thank God, and they wanted the democracy. So that's why, because it's strange. I always, before, studying it, I found it strange how almost overnight Germany, like the Nazi Party, absolutely collapsed. It didn't end. It collapsed as hard as the Soviet Union, but then overnight they had what would quickly become the strongest democratically, configured government with parliament and balance of power, using us as their framework. It became the strongest, safest democracy in Europe.
Trump's response to this has been enormously mute. And he exacerbates this by, he punishes and slaps tariffs on largely democratic countries, and then flies around the world and shakes hands with dictators. That sends a very powerful message to the world as to where the United States is standing. Any other president who saw what's going on in Hong Kong would have immediately sided, left or right, probably would have sided with the people of Hong Kong.
Oh, hands down.
And said,
hands down,
we support their democracy, we support these protests, and China needs to back off. Well, Trump, you might say, well, Trump did do that. He put tariffs on China. Well, those aren't tariffs on China. Those are tariffs on exports from China to the United States that belong to American corporations manufacturing in China. So it's a tax that gets pushed onto the consumer, not the corporation. And so the tax is on the American people, not on China. So he has remained mute about this. He's remained mute about the democratic breakdown in Russia. You see Vladimir Putin has all but dissolved his cabinet and is basically setting himself up for a lifetime presidency. You've been listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you might have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And you can also check out our other episodes at itmightbeinteresting.com.
This is, I think, what I want to talk about next is how does a democratically elected person subvert and undermine democracy throughout the world